this evening we will talk about shade tree pruning. And the reason that we're going to talk about this is because we're going to be getting into a time frame where we can do that pruning and do it safely. But what we're going to talk about is some of the benefits of pruning. So what it is pruning allows us to have some plant maintenance that we're able to control and take care of that plant and maybe get its desired plant size. Now, that is not saying we're going to take a standard size tree and take it down into super ultra dwarf. That's not at all what we're saying. We're going to take into consideration the overall size and kind of manipulate it a little bit, but not to the extremes. The number one reason that we want to prune is to remove those dead, damaged, disease, or even hazardous branches out of the tree. We can also affect that fruit and flower production through our pruning practices. And then we can rejuvenate those neglected plants to a point. There comes a point in time that no matter how much pruning we do, those neglected plants are probably not going to make a full recovery. And then if we want to make those special forms, if we want to make those topiaries, if we want to make hedges, if we want to do things like that, we can do that through pruning. So tonight what we're going to discuss is we are going to discuss the pruning basics. This is going to be the science of pruning and why we prune, when to prune or when we should wait, how to prune. Then we'll talk about some of the tools we can use for pruning, as well as when we know we have good results. So for starters, we're going to talk a little bit about the science of pruning. So in order to talk about the science of pruning, we have to talk about the tree itself. So when it comes to the tree, the outer bark is what we see on the outside of the tree. That's what gives that tree that texture. It helps to protect the tree on the outside. Behind it is the phloem. Now, the phloem is very important because it moves those nutrients from the leaves down. And it's very important that we have that phloem intact. Also, right behind that phloem is a layer that's very important. It's called cambium. And what that cambium layer does is it's undifferentiated. So it will create the phloem on the outside and then it creates the xylem on the inside. And that's what creates those tree rings is that cambium layer on there. Now on the inside of that cambium layer is where we have the xylem and it moves the water from the roots up. This is not one that's easily damaged. Now, the reason we need to know the science of pruning is because anytime we are missing bark on those areas where we're trying to prune, that part of the branch is not going to be moving water and nutrients. And so then you're going to be right against that heartwood. And that's not live tissue. It's not actively growing. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we know and make sure we make the pruning cuts in the proper locations. So that way that tree will seal over those wounds. They don't heal, they seal. So it's going to cover those wounds up. And that's what allows that tree to then be healthy overall. And then it allows it so it's not going to be damaged and it's not as susceptible to some different disease and insect issue. So where we prune is also very important. So at the very top of a limb or a branch is going to be the apical bud. The apical bud is what rules the roost. It's the one that says whether or not those lateral buds can continue to grow or whether it's going to be the guy in charge up at the top. Now, this produces some auxins, and it is one of those that can stimulate those cell elongation and differentiation. So when we prune, especially shade trees, if we have a central leader or a main stem going up and we take the top out of that, that signals those lateral branches to go ahead and break dormancy and go ahead and get to growing. And so what oftentimes happens, especially with conifers, is if we lose that central leader, the very top of the tree, we either need to train a new one, or we're just going to have lateral growth. We're not going to have vertical growth from that point out. So knowing kind of a little bit about how that works is going to play a key role in whether or not we make those pruning cuts at those areas. Also, when we're talking about the science of pruning, we need to make sure that we're making those cuts in the proper location along stems. And this is more for those large shrubs, small trees right here with this one. This isn't so much for those shade trees, but it's good to know that we need to make those pruning cuts at the proper angles. You know, opposite bud trees, we're going to make it straight across, or, you know, alternate buds, we're going to make it more at a 45-degree angle. If we go too much, too high, too shallow, that can all affect that bud growth. So really making sure that we're making these cuts at the proper location is going to be key. So that way we have a long-term healthy plant. So first and foremost, before we do any pruning whatsoever, is we need to know the plant. We need to know the typical morphology or the typical growth patterns of that plant. If that plant is supposed to be a rounded form, if that plant is more of an upright form, that all plays a big role in how we're going to care for that plant long term. So that cultivar varietal differences play a big role. And then another one that we also have to keep in mind is whether or not that tree has been grafted, because that graft needs to be above grade, and we need to make sure that we are very cautious and cognizant of that graft, and we don't go into it or cut into it or cause damage to it. Because what can happen is if the top dies, then it comes from the root growth. And that root stock sometimes is a different cultivar, different selection, different species. And so that can make a big difference. You know those trees that tend to go towards codominance, and codominant leaders are those two forks, you know, where you see that tree and all of a sudden it's got two forks in it. We need to make sure that we take a look at that and we plan for that. Oftentimes when we're looking at young trees, we do a really good job pruning out that double leader when they're about 5-6 foot tall. Once they get to that 8-10 foot tall, you know, we're not able to take care of them like we did when they were smaller. And oftentimes we'll see them put on a codominant leader a little bit taller in the canopy. So make sure that we know kind of what we have going on with that codominance. And then also some species are really prone to included bark. And what happens with included bark, and I've got a picture a little bit later on, but the bark gets in between the trunk tissue and the branch tissue. And because that bark is in between those two tissues, we don't have a very good connection of that branch union. And so that can sometimes lead to a little bit of weakness in that area. Some species are more prone to included bark than others. And so knowing what to look for while we're out there and we're taking a look at our trees is going to be key to know whether or not we need to control them. So reasons for pruning. First and foremost, removed any dead, damaged, diseased, or hazardous limbs from becoming an issue. That's going to be first and foremost when it comes to pruning. We can take those off at any point in time. In the picture, I know it's kind of hard to see, but the lower picture, it is a honey locust. The honey locust has a canker on the upper side, the upper 2/3 of the branch at a branch junction. It is also overhanging a house and a deck. I worked with these homeowners because they're my parents. I told them that that limb needs to be removed, because anytime that we have people underneath, like a dead, damaged, or diseased limb, and it could fall on either a target or a person, then it becomes a hazard. So at that point in time, the probability of failure on that limb was pretty high, just due to the species and due to the underlying conditions that that branch had. So that one needed to come out. Also, you know, in this instance, what would have happened is that branch would have broke off because all the weight is on the underside and out on the outer edge of the limb. And that top part was dead because it didn't have any bark due to the canker. And so it would have broken off and it would have ripped down the trunk of the tree. And a clean cut will heal faster and decrease those secondary infections as opposed to letting Mother Nature kind of do its thing. So, you know, first and foremost, remove any dead, damaged, or diseased, and make sure to be on the lookout for any of those hazardous branches. Now, the next pruning is going to be pruning for plant health. When we prune for plant health, we're looking at pruning for our normal maintenance. These are going to be things that if we have spent flowers, let's say we need to take it off. What we have in this instance is excessive growth. So those of you that don't know, a dwarf Alberta spruce is a selected cultivar of a white spruce. And so what can happen with a dwarf Alberta spruce is it can revert back to the straight species of white spruce. And it does it very regularly. And so that's what's going on in this photo is we have a dwarf Alberta spruce that has begun to revert. Now, dwarf Alberta spruce will grow about a half an inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch a year. The straight species grows much faster than that. And so in this instance, we have a little antler sticking out the top of this dwarf Alberta spruce. Now, the sad part is if we would have caught it sooner, we could have minimized the damage or the hole that leaves in that dwarf Alberta spruce. Once it gets to this size, unfortunately, even if you were to prune out the part that had reverted, you're going to have a big gaping hole in the top. So if you leave it, it's going to grow 3 times faster than the dwarf Alberta spruce. So really, in this instance, you know, there isn't a good answer for this, but it is one opportunity that if you have dwarf Albertas to watch, so that way you can prune it early so we don't have these issues in the future. Another thing that we're going to prune for plant health is the suckers. The suckers are those little advantageous growth that come up around the base of the tree. Some trees are really prone to it, like crab apples, for example. They're going to have those suckers near the base, and you're just going to have to continually prune them, take them out of there, clean it up, because that's just the nature of the beast. Sometimes we can see those excessive shoot growth up in the canopy, so they're called water sprouts at that time. If they go completely vertical, they're really not doing the tree a whole lot of good. So those can be removed. And then we've already talked about our unsightly growth on our dwarf Alberta. So storm damage is its own beast. The thing with storm damage is it usually follows, let's say, that wind event. It follows a tornadic or a really big, you know, event that comes. It can be ice, it can be snow. But the thing to keep in mind is following a storm. First and foremost, we need to look up before we walk under. Sometimes hanging up in the tree are branches that are just barely hanging on. In the industry, those are called widowmakers. And so we need to make sure we look up before we go under to make sure that there are no, you know, hanging branches in there. We want to wait to remove those broken limbs and snags if we can until it's safe to do so. And with storm damaged trees, we're going to take a little bit different approach to it. We're only going to remove those branches that are damaged. We're not going to do any corrective pruning or aesthetic pruning at that point in time. We just want to get it so that plant is safe, and we want to make sure that that plant has the best ability to heal if it can. With any pruning, what we're trying to avoid is we are trying to avoid mass damage and failure and things along those lines. So this big old hackberry had several different things going on inside. As you can tell, it's got some internal rot. We had several leaders. We had codominant stems. And so, you know, if this had been caught sooner, it could have been less detrimental. So that's going to be the key, is we just need to make sure that whatever we do it safely for the long-term health of the tree. Now, when to prune? This is a quite contested debate. So, dormancy is best if you're trying to see branching structure. So, if you've removed all the dead, damaged, diseased, if you just want to know if there's any branches that are crossing, any branches that are going back up into the canopy, things along those lines. When that tree is dormant, that is the best time to see that structure. On the other hand, there is a lot more research that has been done, and this research says that wounds will seal over quicker if they're done during the growing season. So this would be that June, July kind of time frame. If you make pruning wounds at that point in time, they will seal over because they are actively growing. Now, like I said, anything dead, damaged, diseased, or hazardous can be removed at any point in time. You don't need to wait until it's dormant or until it's growing to take those off. That being said, if you have that limb that hits you in the head when you ride underneath it with a lawnmower, or is always, overhanging the sidewalk, or is a clearance issue, don't wait. Go ahead and take it off. It's not worth the fight. So some of those branches, if you can remove them, there's a joke out there that says the best time to prune is when the saw is sharp. So, with that being said, we've given you the rules to follow, but then you can kind of bend them and kind of do what you need to do in order to make your life not as stressful. So when we don't want to prune, we do not want to prune when those plants are stressed. Whether it's water stress, we really want to avoid pruning young trees because we want them to become established before we do a lot of pruning on them, or following transplanting, we don't want to do a lot of pruning on them either. So making sure that we kind of avoid those times is going to be key. We also want to avoid pruning when it's pushing on new growth. So when it's putting leaves on, we don't want to be pruning. That's going to add additional stress to the tree. And in some species, if you prune a little too early, like when it's pushing those leaves out, you might notice it oozing or weeping. Maples are the most dramatic when it comes to that. It's not harmful to the tree, but it does kind of attract different insects. It can attract wildlife. It's a mess. So if we can avoid pruning when that plant is pushing new growth, that's going to be key. And then, right now, we really want to avoid pruning. We want to avoid it when those plants are preparing for dormancy, because we don't want that additional stress to be on that plant at this point in time. Now, there's always exceptions to the rule. Now, with oaks, we need to make sure that we avoid pruning March through July, because we want to avoid that time frame due to oak wilt. And for all of the pruning cuts, except for oak, we want to leave them open to the environment. We don't want to paint them. We don't want to tar them. We don't want to seal them. We want to leave them to the environment. But with oaks, we want to try to seal those pruning cuts. And the reason for that is we want to avoid, getting and attracting insects to that fresh cut wound that can spread oak wilt. And so oaks are the exception to the rule. They have a time frame when we can and shouldn't prune. And then they also have those other practices where we do the sealing cuts. Now, we want to kind of avoid pruning on trees that are questionably hardy for our areas, because we have different parts of the state, and some of them the trees are hardier than others. So we really want to avoid pruning if we can on some of those plants that are questionably hardy. Now, I know everybody has their favorite pruning tools, but we'll talk about just a few of them to kind of give you a quick and dirty when it comes to those pruning tools and good tools that you could have on hand. So, you know, when we're talking about those pruning tools, the first and foremost are going to be those hand pruners, those clippers. There's two different types. There's the bypass, which looks like scissors, and then there's the anvil that looks like the top corner there with the black and yellow handle. Now, the anvil type pruners tend to crush stems a little bit if they're not really sharp, where the bypass pruners are more like a scissors and they will give you a clean cut. So I tend to go towards more the bypass as opposed to the anvil. The thing to keep in mind is get the proper pruner for your hand size, because that's going to be key to make sure that you open and close it fully. And then also, so it's not causing you pain to your hand as well. So making sure that you have the proper sized clippers or pruners for your hand is going to be key. Those work best on twigs up to 3/4 of an inch. Now you can go up to an inch. Just realize if you have to take multiple bites, and you know what I'm talking about, where you have to keep pushing and pushing and get all the way through. If you have to take multiple bites of your pruning tool, you have a too small of a pruning tool for that branch. The next step up is going to be those loppers. Those are going to be the long handled ones. You know, those branches we can cut up to 1.75 inches up to 2 inches or so. But those are ones that if you have to take multiple bites with that pruner, you are using something that's way too small. And then the next one's going to be a pruning saw. Now, this is different than the wood saw that we all had in shop class. These are pruning saws. So they are made to cut and they are very sharp. So we need to make sure that we use a lot of caution when we're using these pruning saws to make sure that we are not going to cut ourselves, you know, cut anybody around us, because they are very sharp. And then we've got the pole pruners. These are ones that also can do branches up to 2 inches. Now, keep in mind with the pole pruners, we are normally pruning up above our head. So we also need to use caution while we're pruning so we don't have those branches fall back down on us. And then lastly, the one that requires a little bit more safety equipment. Now, all of them we should be wearing gloves, all of them we should be wearing safety glasses. But with the chainsaw, this is one where we want to make sure that we're using the right kind of gloves. Maybe we're using those chainsaw chaps that are made to stop the chainsaw chain from going into our flesh and things like that if it was to kick back. So, you know, if we have branches greater than 3 inches, we can go ahead and use that chainsaw. Just avoid that top quadrant, that top upper right quadrant when it comes to that chainsaw, because that's kind of the kickback area. But that is one that works really well. A lot of people use chainsaws. Just make sure that we're using caution. We're using our face protection. We can even use hearing protection with that chainsaw as well. So making sure that we're using all of our safety equipment on top of that. Now, when it comes to whatever tool we decide to use, we need to make sure that we sharpen and clean it regularly. This is going to be key to have the longest health of and longevity when it comes to our pruning tools. So make sure that we dry and oil them after use. I'm not real good about that. I need to get better at it. But one that we also need to keep in mind is if we are pruning infected plant material. So let's say we're pruning an apple tree or a crab apple that could possibly have fire blight. That's where we want to disinfect these pruning tools. We need to make sure that we're not moving that disease from plant to plant. So in terms of disinfecting, 10% bleach solution. You can either have it in a squirt bottle, you can dip it. Any of those will work out well, but we need to make sure that we're disinfecting those pruning tools so we're not spreading disease. And then we need to make sure we use the smallest tool that gets the job done. So if we can avoid removing those larger limbs, that's going to be key. We want to make sure that if we can remove a limb with those hand pruners, that's going to be the #1 thing that we're going to try to do. Now, our proper pruning techniques. We want to observe the plant. We want to make sure that we begin with that end in mind. And the form follows the function. So we need to make sure, first and foremost, we're removing the dead, damaged, and the disease. Then we're going to move on to the crossing and overlapping branches. And then after we do that, we're going to prune for the desired shape. So we're going to aim to remove no more than 1/3 of the canopy at any one point in time. With an older tree, a more mature tree, we don't want to remove more than 1/4 of the canopy at any one point in time. So the thing with pruning is we need to make sure that we determine if the benefits of the pruning outweigh the risks or the disadvantages. And then also, when we're pruning, we need to prune safely. Do not be like this gentleman who just climbed up in the tree with no safety harness. His gloves are in his back pocket, no hearing protection, no eye protection, in a questionable tree, actively aging, probably shouldn't have climbed up in there anyway. This is my dad. He knew I was taking the photo for educational purposes while he was cutting down my tree. But making sure that we prune it safely. You know, we need to make sure that we keep in mind the weight, the leverage, the ergonomics if we're using a tool over and over and over again. Make sure that we're doing those proper pruning tools and we're doing it correctly. So if it's something that we can't reach from the ground, we can't reach safely from a step ladder, if it's something of high risk or very large size, or it's near the house or over anything near a power line, we use a professional. If the tree is within 10 feet of a power line, we need to contact a professional. We should not be doing that because there's just too many opportunities for something to go wrong. So making sure that we prune safely. So before we prune, we need to ask ourselves, does that tree or do those branches really need pruning? And the reason for that is because pruning creates wounds that allow entry for diseases and insects. It also removes some stored food and reduces that food production because without that canopy, we're missing out on all those leaves. It can also disrupt the structural balance and lead to greater damage for ice and wind. And over pruning can lead to sun scald, this decay, sprouting, root decline, so many different things within the tree. And the thing to keep in mind is branches are easy to remove, but they're impossible to put back on. So over pruning is super easy to do. And one of the things that we often get is people will say, well, I need to thin the tree. I need to go in and thin the canopy. Well, minimize the amount of limb removal. General thinning is typically unnecessary. You know, if you're not going to be removing anything dead, damaged, or diseased, you just want to open the canopy up. You know, does that pruning really need to be done is going to be that first thing. So try to preserve as much of that structure as possible. You know, the thing to keep in mind is there's no law that says all the limbs need to be moved up or limbed up several feet above the ground, unless there are some laws and regulations in cities and municipalities with clearance of trees near sidewalks and streets and with sight lines and things like that. But if you have a tree in the middle of your lawn, there's nothing that says you have to remove those lower limbs. If you choose to do so, we do a 2/3 rule. We're going to do 2/3 top and we're going to do 1/3 of trunk. We need to prune for structure and correcting the form. And, you know, there's so many different reasons why we want to prune. So we are going to prune because of a very weak branch union that's very narrow. Those codominant competing leaders with these. We're going to remove those shapes. We're going to raise that canopy. We're going to remove those damaged limbs. So, you know, pruning is about correcting the structure and form. We talked about included bark, and here's just an interior view of included bark. On the left, it's got it on the outside, so you can kind of see where it's kind of squeezed together. When you put your thumb next to your hand, it kind of looks like included bark. And then the other arrow with the pencil is kind of showing you what the included bark looks like. So consider the tree's natural form. You know, are there any targets? Are there any site conflicts? And if at all possible, can we eliminate these structural problems early on before they become a problem? We talked about those trees with multiple leaders. What we have is a tree with 3 leaders on one side. Those are usually weakly attached together. The other one is our very favorite linden. That linden is prone to so many different things, but one of them is going to be some of those branches. It can be included bark. So, you know, if we can take care of it early, that's going to be key. Now, when we're talking about pruning, we need to know about the tree anatomy. So when it comes to making those branches and those cuts, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we make those cuts around this area in here, where that we want to make sure that we're making that cut on the outside of what they call the branch collar. So the branch collar is going to be right here in that location, that swollen area near the edge, right there. And so we need to make sure that we don't go into that branch collar, because then it's not going to seal over properly. We also want to avoid the branch bark ridge. The branch bark ridge is usually going to be in that area in between the branch unions. Again, that's an area where a lot of tissue differentiation happens, and we want to make sure we avoid those areas as well. We also need to make sure that we take a look at those narrow branching angles or that narrow crotch area. And we want to avoid that because that's going to create some more opportunities for included bark. We want to make sure that we leave those that have the strong branching angles of 45 to 60. And then one of the things we keep in mind is we want to make sure that we make the cuts at the proper spots. So we just don't want to go up and make a pruning cut up in this area with a tiny little branch there. What we want to do is we want to go back to a substantial branch and make that 45-degree angle away from the bud and make sure that we create a nice clean cut. So when it comes to our conifers, they've got a very dramatic branch collar. And when you're pruning, you should be able to see that swollen tissue there where that branch collar is. And you want to make that pruning cut on the outside of that. So that way that branch collar can then create that callus tissue that seals over that wound. On our hardwoods, it's not as easy to tell. Some species, it's a little bit easier, but some aren't. So you want to take a look for that branch collar. It's going to be that area with that swollen tissue right near the edge of the branch, and we want to avoid that when we're cutting. The dead limbs are going to tell you right where that branch collar is located at. It's going to give you a general idea because that callus tissue is going to start to form and it's going to start to seal over that wound. So that's the good news with a dead branch. If we have large limbs, these are going to be those limbs that are 4 inches in diameter. They're going to be greater than that. Those are going to be the ones that we're going to use a chainsaw with more than likely. We have to do it's suggested that we do the 3-cut method. And the reason we're suggesting doing a 3-cut method is because the first cut cuts on the underside. And what it does is it helps to prevent a limb from coming down and ripping the bark off down the trunk of the tree. The second cut removes the weight on the outer edge of the branch. So cut 2 will go all the way through. And then cut 3 removes that stub back at the branch collar on the outside of the branch collar. So for those large limbs, we do the 3-cut method, and this helps to alleviate the weight on the trunk and ripping down, because if we don't do the 3-cut method, this is what we have. So that first cut, that undercut, is very important, especially with some of these, because all that weight on the branch, if we just make that cut, gravity is just going to have it go straight down. This gives you a good example of where the branch collar is located at with that swollen tissue back in here. And then also it gives you a nice clean cut. We don't want to cut straight down because then that's going to cut into that branch collar. We need to make sure that we cut with the branch, not the trunk, because flush cutting is what it's called if we make that cut up and down. And what happens if we do a flush cut, that tree is not able to put the callus tissue on there, and it doesn't create that target kind of opening to it or that donut over the top of that cut. And so some trees are really poor at compartmentalization or stopping the rot where it originates. And so by making a proper pruning cut, it allows it to seal over quicker and it decreases the chance of that fungal pathogens finding their way inside. If we do a flush cut, then we make a larger wound that usually takes out some of that callus tissue, and that tree's not able to seal over that wound. So good cuts end up like donuts. I mean, there's worse things out there, but we need to make sure that we leave that branch collar intact, that we are cutting across the branch, not following the trunk, because we want that to look like a good donut. And with time, what's going to happen is that donut is going to seal over completely to a point where it's going to be completely closed around that. So that one is going to be key. If we do a clean cut, then we're going to have those nice ones. So we have, if you need some more information, I've put a couple links, and I know Scott has put them into the chat, with the Nebraska Forest Service has a couple of publications on pruning trees. And then they also have one on pruning large trees. So that one might be one, if you have a few large trees that need to be pruned, you can take a look at.